Best advice for a CISO. Go.
My best advice for a CISO is question whether it's something that you really, really want. And I've heard this from a bunch of folks throughout my career, and I think it's spot on. I think a lot of folks look at the role and they think about all the perceived glory and seat at the table and all of those things, but I don't think that they fully appreciate all the time the grind that the role is and the stress that it entails and the anxiety that it always creates on a day-to-day basis. So I think you really have to want it if you're going to be successful in this space. So just be sure that it's something that you actually want to do.
It's time to begin the CISO Series podcast.
Welcome to the CISO Series podcast. My name is David Spark. I'm the producer of the CISO Series. I don't know if you're aware of this, but if you want to get more content from the CISO Series, you could go to our web address, and that's at CISOseries.com. Many people don't know this, Mike. Mike is my co-host for this episode. Mike, say hello to the audience.
Hello, audience.
Do you know who's responsible for naming this organization, our media company CISO Series?
I do not. This is news to me.
It's my wife. You know what she also named? She named our show Defense in Depth. She came up with that one.
2 for 2.
And I believe she's also responsible for the name of our show, Capture the CISO. I have not paid her anything for this.
Did she name the cybersecurity headlines show?
No, that one I came up with. That wasn't.
Okay. So you managed to name one of these.
Yes, I did. I did come up with cybersecurity headlines, but she named all the other shows. There's a little bit of trivia that people don't know is that she's responsible for all the naming, not all, but the critical naming of many of our programs and our organization name for that matter.
Future trivia question at a bar near you.
Future trivia. When we become big enough that people at bars know who we are.
We're already there, David.
By the way, let me ask you if you've ever done this. I was at a bar chatting with a woman who was a little inebriated. And she all of a sudden wanted to talk business, and she was really kind of on the drunk side. And I was like, maybe we shouldn't be talking business if you're this inebriated. And then the next day she reached out, and I'm like, via LinkedIn, I'm like, do you remember me?
Do you remember where you agreed to sell me that particular product? You had a 99% discount. Let's move forward with that deal.
Oh, by the way, I think I might have told you this story. I had a situation where there was a product I was using. They drastically changed their pricing model, which literally shot the prices up skyward. And I had a problem with how the product worked. And they said, well, what if we gave you an 80% discount? And I was like, what? And this was for a SaaS-based software. And I was like, so you've been gouging me that much?
Yeah. They broke the news the hard way to you, David.
Yeah. If you're gouging, we're not going to do business together at all.
You've been overpaying for quite some time.
No, first of all, this was when they wanted to change the model drastically, which I wasn't interested in. The previous model, they were overpaying too, but it wasn't like a hellacious level. I didn't mention our sponsor. Let me mention our sponsor. Our sponsor for today's episode is Varonis. Longtime sponsor of the CISO series. We love having them on board. And not only that, they're also the leader in data security. More about exactly that and what they can do to help you detect anomalous behavior and help improve the way you manage risk later in the show. So I am excited to bring our guest on, who we had on Defense in Depth. Actually, it was a long time to get him on Defense in Depth. And once we had him on Defense in Depth, I said, would you like to come on CISO Series podcast? And he said, of course, love to come on. As long as I'm on with Mike Johnson. He said, anybody else, forget it.
Sure, that's exactly how thank you for continuing to cuddle my ego, David.
I want you to know the only time I lie is when I can pump up somebody else's ego. That will be the only time I lie.
Thank you.
Just to make you... Yeah, and by the way, our audience knows, if you're not following this person on LinkedIn, you should be, because he posts amazing posts, gets great discussions going. And in fact, many of our segments today are based on his discussions. Let's bring him on. He is the EVP and CISO over at Equifax, Jamil Farsi. Jamil, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And was it true that you said only if I could be on with Mike Johnson?
Of course that's true. Yeah.
You see, he's going with the lie too.
Yes. Yeah. I appreciate that now.
Are we having communication issues?
One of the toughest jobs in cybersecurity, and particularly for a CISO, is communication. Jamil, you recently wrote on LinkedIn, remember people, I mentioned this, that it would be the one thing you would fix about cyber before anything else. Since we can't snap our fingers and wish it fixed, one of the things you recommended to help improve communications was, quote, always be on the hunt for captivating. You suggest anything that could grab someone's attention, from visuals to cultural references. So I'm going to just throw out one in general. Anytime you can make an analogy or a metaphor about something, man, that sticks. But I want to hear from you. Give me examples of how you've actually done this. Make something captivating and stick. And what was the net result of that?
I mean, even you mentioned LinkedIn. I do it on there all the time. I mean,
yes, that's why I said people check it out.
Yeah. Even earlier this year, I did a post about that show that was a video, Last of Us, about the fungi, and used that as the basis for calling out risks and how we talk about risks all the time. But unfortunately, many of them go unaddressed. And just like in Last of Us, those unaddressed risks can sometimes cause a calamity in the distant future. So, but a more specific one in terms of my day-to-day, we had a board meeting earlier this year, where I was trying to cover AI and the security risks. And so instead of just putting together a slide with a bunch of bullets on things to worry about, I created a deep fake of my CEO and I showed it to the board.
Wow.
And it changed the game. I mean, you could look around the table and they were just in awe of what AI can do and how easy it is to be able to completely replicate somebody else, top to bottom, voice and all, to be able to execute this kind of thing. So it's things like that truly move the needle, I think. And I can tell you this today, there's no doubt that every single one of my board members, because of the approach that we took there, understands what the risks are and they take them seriously.
Showing a deep fake, that is a great, great move. All right, throwing this one to you, Mike. What have you done that really stuck, that really captivated your audience?
The metaphor concept is really a good one. You can take a technical challenge out of our jargon, out of our gobbledygook that we always talk amongst ourselves, and relate it to something that someone is used to. It's always great to use physical security metaphors because people interact with those on a daily basis at their home, just going out in the world. I used one talking about doors and locks and keys to really talk about containers and perimeters inside perimeters, defense in depth kinds of concepts. And in that situation, it was this business leader needed to make a call one way or the other on a direction. And they didn't understand the technical aspects of it, and it's not their job to understand that. So by using the metaphors and putting it in terms that they could very easily relate to, it allowed them to make the decision on the path to take versus either, analysis paralysis or, frankly, maybe going in the wrong direction, thinking they understood what was going on. So that was really the outcome of it.
And quickly from both of you, why is it so critical to do this, to make sure your audience gets it versus, I trust you, Jamil, you know what you're doing?
Because it makes it relatable and it sticks. So let me give you an example. I talk about partnership all the time, and I have a personal story that I can highlight that's not cyber related, but I think it really drives the point home. So during COVID, it's the middle of the night. I'm in bed. My wife, my at the time I had she was 3 years old, little daughter in her crib, and I get woken up. And it was at 1 a.m., 1:16 a.m. in the morning. I had 4 Atlanta PD officers in my bedroom. And I'm like, what is going on? And I sleep like a log. So I'm just completely have no idea what's happening. Turns out what happened was someone broke into my house in the middle of the night while we were home. So it was a home invasion. And one thing leads to another, and I'm like, how did the APD get into my house? Like, how did they know this happened? And it wasn't they had bypassed my security system, and the glass break and all that stuff didn't work, which was awesome. Make sure you test your home security system. Is some advice there. So that didn't work. My dogs didn't do anything. They were just sleeping away just like I was. So nothing stopped them except for this one thing. My next door neighbor heard the glass break, looked out their window. I live in the city, and so our houses are fairly close together. Heard the glass break, saw the people literally climbing into my house, and called the police. And so, boom, they came. Who knows what would have happened had they not contacted them? Because none of us knew anything about it, obviously, because we were sleeping. But because of that, the intruders ran away and the police were there to save the day. So that's exactly what we deal with in security, right? It's that kind of partnership, that kind of insight that we get can save the day. It can be the difference between having a normal day and having a very, very bad one. And so I tell that story just as an example of how you can bring personal stories into the work we do every day that gets people to remember and truly associate and understand the topics that you're trying to discuss.
What's the best way to handle this?
How do we get better at making cybersecurity a team sport? We've seen this with ISACA groups that are industry focused, but those are usually private to private partnerships. How are public entities playing along? Now, on CSO Online, Christopher Burgess pointed to Big Pipes, a group of private and FBI security professionals working to disrupt DDoS booster services as an example. We know these partnerships have value, but how have you experienced them in terms of outreach, and what kind of value do they offer versus working strictly with just your industry colleagues? Mike.
Yeah, so there's another one to call out. I think it's just called the Ransomware Task Force. Big Pipes is a much cooler name than Ransomware Task Force.
They both work.
But an advantage that you have with working with the public sector, specifically law enforcement, even on a global basis, is they can actually arrest people. Your industry peers, unless you're in a very specific industry, can't do that.
As much as we would like to.
As much as we would like to. And that's really a way of increasing the pain to our adversaries. If they actually have to worry about prison time, then their actions will change.
That's an interesting level because often you have said, I designed my security program just to make it not cost effective or worthy to break in. But you add that layer of, hey, we actually work with the feds, could be a bad situation for you beyond just that.
Yes. And again, it's additional costs and risk for the attacker. And if they're assuming that more and more companies are having similar conversations with their law enforcement and not sweeping things under the rug, it increases the risk and that increases the cost. So that's really an advantage about these public-private partnerships. There's others, but that's one of the obvious ones.
What's been your experience, Jamil?
I've had a fantastic experience with government and public-private partnership, especially as of late. And I'm going to harken back to another LinkedIn post that I wrote earlier this year. We were the target of an attempted ransomware attack earlier in the 23, and we got a heads up from CISA 124 hours before the attack hit us.
Oh my God, that's a nice warning.
Yeah. Exactly 124 hours. And so we had a fantastic heads up. And as a result, we were able to test all our controls, make sure everything was in place. And so by the time it eventually landed, it was super boring. It was nothing to see because we had gotten that heads up. And I think that is an example of the type of benefit that organizations derive from establishing those partnerships in advance. The problem I see is that there just continues to be this old tape being played about these partnerships and how they're one-sided or whatever. But I think just like with anything in life, nothing comes from nothing. And so to expect that you're just going to magically get this gift dropped into your lap, but after putting in no effort whatsoever to establish a relationship and to build those communication channels, I think it's just plain unrealistic. And so, at least from my experience, having put in the time and effort to make sure that those relationships are there, the communication channels are established, I get a tremendous amount, and my team gets a tremendous amount of value out of working with the government and with those public-private partnerships.
It is just like the story you said about your neighbor. I'm assuming you had a relationship with your neighbor before your neighbor put that call in.
This is true.
Before we go on any further, I do want to mention our spectacular sponsor, and that would be Varonis. Thank you, Varonis, for supporting the CISO series through all these many years. Now listen to what Varonis can do. Go from data darkness to automated data protection with Varonis, the leader in data security. It's a dozen security products in one. Varonis tackles hundreds of use cases, making it the ultimate platform to stop data breaches without adding more work onto your team. Within minutes, you'll be equipped to detect anomalous behavior, ensure compliance, and remediate risks to your sensitive data in the cloud and on-prem. Kind of like what a security team does, right? Varonis can help. Reduce your risk without taking on any, and see Varonis in action today at, I'm going to give you a website. I want you to remember this. It's varonis.com/CISO series. VARONIS.com/CISO series. Check them out.
It's time to play What's Worse?
All right, Jamil, you're familiar with this game?
I am.
All right. Two bad scenarios. You're not going to like either one of them.
I'm a little nervous.
You have to tell me which one's worse. I'm going to have Mike answer first. This one's a little bit more involved, so you may want to take a note or two. This comes from a new submitter. We've never had something from him before. It's Aaron Stanley, who's VP of Security for DBT Labs. And here are the two scenarios. Scenario number one. You run a mock incident exercise where the number one outcome is a realization that because of how your support and security functions are staffed, it would likely take weeks, maybe even months, before you could effectively communicate to impacted customers that you had experienced a security incident. This delay would violate most, if not all, of your contractual obligations with enterprise customers and could get you in trouble with the regulators. I know it's not sounding good. When you read this out to your executive team and recommend the hiring of additional support and security staff, which would necessitate canceling one of your major feature branches this year, they say they would rather accept the risk. Okay, just so you know, Mike, both of these at the end, they accept the risk. So don't use that as your tool of, oh, I'll take that one because they accept the risk. All right, just so you know, because the next one ends that way as well.
Okay. So this is still just number one.
That's just number one, okay?
Okay.
So you understand the situation here. It's going to impact customers. You're not going to be able to tell them. You're going to violate a ton of contractual obligations and regulators. And you offer a solution, but you'd have to shut down a branch, which would hurt the business. All right. Scenario number two. You run a mock incident exercise where the number one outcome is realization that due to a technical decision made long ago, it would be impossible for you to identify which customers were impacted by a security incident in your production environment. Engineering estimates that the fix would require them to cancel one major customer feature this year. The executive team decides that this is an acceptable risk. Which one's worse?
Okay, so I think I have these. So the first one, essentially this is a response versus detection question.
Well, you can detect, but you can't identify.
Okay, so in the second scenario, we know something happened, we just don't know which customers it happened to.
Yeah, so it's going to be like playing Russian roulette with your customers.
Right, and in the first one, we can theoretically detect who it happens to, but it takes us forever to figure out who that is.
I thought they were both coming from a crisis exercise. So aren't they both theoretical?
It's like,
Yeah.
You know you have this fallibility is what it is. It hasn't actually happened, but you know it. And the executive team is taking the risk in either scenario.
Sure. But the first one, the fallibility is the length at which it would take to notify.
Correct.
Okay. So the way that I see this, and Aaron will have to have a conversation later about submitting what's worse questions and making them really difficult. Aaron and I have known each other for a while, so that's where that comes from.
Okay.
So I can give him a hard time.
Sure.
What I would say would be that inability to notify within a regulatory requirement window, that really is going to be the worst case of these two. That gets you into fines, that gets you into potentially very large fines, and maybe even having to change where you do business. Like that's really going to be the worst of these two scenarios. The second one, it's going to really suck to have to send out a broad notification of, all right, well, we think everyone's impacted because we can't tell who precisely is impacted. That's essentially what you have to do. Is you have to assume everyone is impacted.
But you know what? We've all received those emails. Like, you may have been.
Right.
And a lot of us ignore it too.
Exactly. And so it's painful for sure. These both suck. But at least in that second scenario, you're able to meet your regulatory obligations. And that's the one that I would prefer. So really, I think the one that is worse is it'll take us forever to notify. We're going to get regulators very unhappy with us. That's the worst of the two.
All right. Jamil, agree or disagree?
I agree. That's exactly what I would do too. And it's the same logic I sort of went through as well.
So really the blame is right now on Aaron for not making this difficult enough for you? Is that what you're saying, Mike? You want to dress him down fully now?
No. And Aaron, thank you for the question. It really is, when you're looking at response, and we've talked about this on other episodes, is the way that you respond is what really matters the most. And in this scenario, and we've unfortunately been in situations where you can't tell exactly who was impacted, but really not being able to notify in a timely fashion really is going to be the more painful one.
Are we making the situation better or worse?
So last year, the Bipartisan Policy Center released its top risks in cybersecurity 2023 report. Now, Jamil, you were a co-author on it. So let's dig into where that report stands a year later, because we're at the end of 2023. That we're recording this, by the way, people are hearing this a little bit later, just so you know, we're recording this at the end of December 2023. So some of the risks were spinning the hits, like talent scarcity or the cyber arms race. But two risks stood out, and these are the ones I want to focus on, was lagging corporate governance. That's the lack of technical expertise on boards. And the other was overlapping, conflicting, and subjective regulations, essentially calling out the patchwork of laws we're operating under. So isolating these two in particular, Jamil, do you see any improvement on either of these, or have they gotten worse?
Were you dicking me with that spin in the hits comment a second ago?
This is a line I say to my sisters all the time when they complain about something. Go, you're just spinning the hits, aren't you, right now? So,
well, I think we it's funny when we completed that, we were debating about. We're like, man, a lot of this stuff is there. These are vulnerabilities. These are weaknesses that we've had forever, and we thought about switching it up, but then we're like, no, because these are actually what the risks are. Whether it's past this prologue or not, we're gonna stick with what we believe is true.
No, but that's why I pulled out those two, because those were quite unique to a list. I should just mention that Mike and I, we've talked about that. We've covered what we'll see in next year, and been doing this for the past 5 years, and pretty much the list is what we saw last year, but just more of that is really what it's always been.
It's true. It's true. I mean, the one that we missed, honestly, last year was AI.
Yes.
We did not have that in there. Although, I mean, I don't know, in many respects, I'm not sure that it's really had a significant impact from a risk perspective this year. But
it's a significant impact of attention perspective. But let's go back to these two about the lagging corporate governments and the sort of the subjective patchwork of regulations. What do you think? Are we improving or falling apart on this?
I think one is improved. I mean, if you look at the data, the number of corporate directors with cybersecurity expertise has increased this year, ever so marginally. Nevertheless, I think that is an improvement. And I think that certainly in the wake of the SEC rules, I think we're going to see more and more of that in the future. Now, whether those roles will be filled by more CISOs, I'm not sure, but certainly there will at least be some more technical expertise that will be in the boardrooms, which I think will be useful. I also think because of those rules, the SEC rules, that there has been a much greater focus on governance, cyber governance in general. And so I think that one has improved. I think in terms of
Well, there's just been a lot of press on it in general. Like people are just reading about it more.
Yeah, but the press has driven a lot of discussions in boardrooms. I mean, I can't tell you how many CISOs I've talked to over, just the last couple of months alone that have had active dialogues with their boards of directors, with their GCs, with their securities lawyers on this topic and are making changes and building out processes in the wake of it. So I think all of that is largely good. So improvement there. Now, in terms of the harmonization of everything, I'm not sure that we've seen much advancement and improvement there, but the NCD has an initiative on it. I know CISA, Director Easterly is working on this. And so I know that there are a lot of eyes on the problem. And so I would expect that we're going to see some progress on it this year or in 24. But to date, from a practical standpoint, I haven't really seen anything tangible come out yet.
Here's the opportunity I see. And I see one lawyer that's actually trying to pull this off is I use a payroll service, and we have employees like all over the country in different states, and there are different state tax laws all over the state. There's no conceivable way I could keep track of all this nonsense. I think there's a huge opportunity for some kind of middle layer, an organization to keep track of all these regulations for everybody. And then you just sort of do a pay-as-you-go service like I do with the payroll to deal with this. What do you think of that, Mike?
It totally exists. It's called outside counsel.
Just outside. They know all the laws already?
They do. Or if they don't, they can get you the answer.
Forget the outside counsel. I'm looking for the SaaS service.
Well, I think where you start having those challenges is there's not really bright lines, and you end up having to make decisions on the fly, especially where you have laws on the national level that conflict with each other, where you have one country is saying you must protect this data and another saying you must preserve this data and you must give it to us. Those really are challenging at a global level. And so I don't see that changing anytime soon because the root of that is sovereignty. Take, for example, the data residency laws that we see quite often either being debated or potentially being passed. China has a data sovereignty law. India has a data sovereignty law. And that is in conflict with some of the ways that the services that we operate really work. So I think that actually gets worse before it gets better, unfortunately, because countries will continue passing laws with their own best interest in mind. And that's what they should be doing. That is really what a government is expected, is to protect its citizens. And it's going to take some hardcore debate at a global level to really make any significant improvements there.
Dumb CISO mistakes.
How bad is a self-inflicted data leak? Now, this recently came up on the cybersecurity subreddit with a submitter saying their CISO published their vulnerability dashboard on LinkedIn. As one commenter suggested, the CISO might have just signed up for a free pen test. Now, others suggested following the same procedures you would with any other data leak, analyzing what was actually exposed and follow procedure based on that. That's the key question for everyone. What honestly, I'll start with you, Mike, what honestly kind of dashboard show that could be damaging if actually leaked?
So I really feel like we're missing something here. Like this is...
Now, a dashboard could say anything, obviously, but...
Exactly.
Yeah. But like, I'm just saying, like, in the spectrum of dashboards you've seen, like, oh, geez, I'd never want that one leak. Or if that one is, it's a bunch of red, yellow, green lights. It won't tell you anything.
I mean, you can have some detailed dashboards that are basically, here is the path of ownership to, if you really want to get at this data, here's a very clear path to get through it. It's unlikely, but it could exist.
That's a worst case scenario. And also, and it's a photo and you've got the admin password on the screen.
Right. I think the thing to keep in mind is with dashboards like that, you actually have to assume that there's an adversary in your environment who can see it.
Mm-hmm. But we're saying like someone posted this on Reddit, I think.
Sure. But I guess really what my point is, we should be careful about our dashboards in the first place, such that actually publishing it, I mean, maybe that's actually a bright line of, is this a dashboard that you would, how bad would it be if you actually posted this dashboard publicly? Like that's a thought exercise to look at your dashboards.
Do you ever think about that?
Nope. Hadn't thought about it till just now.
All right.
And I think if that is the case, then that dashboard needs to be tightly access controlled. But if it's a dashboard that it's not the end of the world, maybe doesn't feel great if it gets out, maybe that's actually something you can share internally broadly with your company and can use to drive change within your organization. Maybe it's something that we don't have to keep secret internally, because being more open with it internally gets you more results. But again, if it's something that you don't want to see a screenshot of externally, probably need to have strong access controls around it.
All right, Jamil, I throw this to you. How awful would be a screenshot of a dashboard? Would it be, and again, I know this is like, how long is a piece of string, but in terms of best and worst cases you've seen, what do you think?
Well, just to level set, you're talking to a guy who actually exposes his cloud security to all of his customers. So I have a pretty meaningful tolerance for and focus on transparency. But that said, I don't know what this dashboard was exactly, but I can imagine some of the dashboards that I've seen, and a lot of them nowadays get pretty detailed. But if it's got things like an IP address of an asset or the OS type or the CVE, I mean, that could be pretty damning and pretty useful to the bad guys, especially if it's sitting there on the open internet. So I guess I'd have to see what specifically this was. But I think the first thing I would do is just go and delete all my social media accounts, because I clearly am not very adept at using them. But I think I generally agree with what I think you said the broader sentiment was, which is just follow your standard processes in terms of responding to it. I mean, I look at the intelligence-driven approach and you try to figure out, like, what was the exposure? How easily can it be exploited? Is there any kind of activity out in the wild that would potentially affect this? Do I have countermeasures in place? Sort of go through the list to be able to help manage that situation. The technical part of the situation, the ego part, not sure you can really do much about that.
Well, we're not here to control people's egos, although we started the show pumping up Mike's ego, didn't we?
Yeah, so it's a great way to wrap it up. We've bookended it with talking about egos.
Egos. Well, talking about tearing down people's egos at the end, which we're not doing. Hey, I'm very thrilled pumping up your ego, Jamil, that you joined us today, because it's a thrill. It's a treat to have you on this show. It's awesome. With that said, we're wrapping up this show. I want to thank our sponsor, Varonis. Remember, the leader in data security? I gave you a web address, and I'm going to give it to you again, and I want you to check it out. It's varonis.com/CISO series. That's VARONIS.com/CISO series. Go check out how they can help you reduce risk without taking on any. See Varonis in action. Go there today. I also want to thank you, Mike. Mike, do you have any, by the way, Jamil, you get the last word. Mike, any last words you'd like to say on today's episode?
Yeah, Jamil, thank you for joining us. I've been a fan of you on LinkedIn, and so it was great to finally get the opportunity to sit down and chat with you. I really like your concentration on relationships and partnerships. I know it is something that we talk a lot about on this show, but you gave some really great examples, both from your personal life with the neighbor and also talking about the public-private partnerships. Thanks for sharing those stories, and thanks for joining us.
Well, guys, this has become my favorite podcast, and so you can call me anytime. I'd be...
Hold on, you need to... I have to put that quote out there.
I genuinely appreciate the opportunity, and you guys keep fighting the good fight. You're on the front lines, and I think you're really making a difference by helping to inform and educate the whole cadre of security folks out there, and you're going to help build up that next generation of cyber leaders. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamil. Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you very much to our audience. We greatly appreciate your contributions and listening to the CISO Series podcast.
That wraps up another episode. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do. We have lots more shows on our website, CISOseries.com. Please join us on Fridays for our live shows, Super Cyber Friday, our virtual meetup, and Cybersecurity Headlines Week in Review. This show thrives on your input. Go to the Participate menu on our site for plenty of ways to get involved, including recording a question or a comment for the show. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact David Spark directly at david@cisoseries.com. Thank you for listening to the CISO Series podcast.